abroad to the extent that they are not dead, in which case they're clearly not available to run against him in elections. But this again is the problem of a country like Russia, that the people who could conceivably form an opposition against Putin or whoever is in charge in an autocracy like Russia, they are not in the country. And if you're not in the country, you're not a credible opponent, which is why Alexei Navalny insisted on returning to Russia, because how can you run against Putin or form opposition against Putin? You have less credibility if you're abroad, and you also have less ability to organize.
Now, he's been in power for almost a quarter of a century. Vladimir Putin's reshaped Russia, eliminated genuine political rivals. But despite that, for the next 3 days, polls are open, online and in person, in Russia's presidential election. The Kremlin insists on putting voters through this process, which critics say that's just rubber stamping Putin's grip on the country. The Kremlin even sort of admit that these elections are essentially meaningless. The Kremlin spokesperson said this was a costly bureaucratic procedure, saying it's obvious that Putin's going to be re-elected. So what's going on, and how can one person capitalise so much power? Elizabeth Braw is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the author of Goodbye Globalisation, and joins me now. Elizabeth, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm just going to start by sort of asking the obvious. What's happening over the next 3 days isn't free or fair?
In theory, it's free and fair, because elections are taking place and Russian voters can cast a ballot for whichever candidate they like. But the choice is very limited, and there aren't really candidates that offer an alternative to Putin. And the elections themselves, the process of casting that ballot, also isn't entirely free. So it's it has the whole. In theory, it is what we would call a democratic election. But then when you look at the way it's carried out, it's neither free nor fair.
Putin and sort of his spin doctors, they've had now 24 years to kind of perfect their illusion of democracy, haven't they?
Russia is yet another case where a politician, a leader, starts out as a relatively legitimate leader. So we should remember that Putin, in the first election he won, that election was really reasonably free and fair, and he won it against other candidates that one could argue and had the same chance as him of winning. Yes, it wasn't perfectly free and fair, but that's how he started. And then he has gone through this arc that most autocrats go through, that at every stage, in every election, the election became less free and fair. And now we have reached this point where this election that is taking place as we speak is really not free and fair anymore. And the reality with autocrats is that they need to cling on to power, because there was so little legitimacy to begin with, that every election then becomes essentially more and more of an affirmation or confirmation of their hold on power.
Of course. If you are living in Russia, is Putin popular?
We don't know, because as in other autocracies, there are no opinion poll firms that can really be trusted. At the beginning of his rule, of his period in power, there were opinion poll firms that could be trusted. But as Russia has become increasingly autocratic, those firms have either disappeared or become less reliable, either because they struggle to get dependable information from voters who worry about giving their views to pollsters, or because they themselves feel pressure to deliver results that won't get them into trouble with the regime. And this, again, is what always happens in autocracies.
who are currently Putin's opponents? You know, how likely is it that someone could say, do you know what? There's a situation and a position where you could actually vote for me.
They are either in jail or abroad, to the extent that they are not dead, in which case they're clearly not available to run against him in elections. But this again is the problem of a country like Russia, that the people who could conceivably form an opposition against Putin or whoever is in charge in an autocracy like Russia, they are not in the country. And if you're not in the country, you're not a credible opponent, which is why Alexei Navalny insisted on returning to Russia, because how can you run against Putin or form opposition against Putin? You have less credibility if you're abroad, and you also have less ability to organize. So his wife, Yulia Navalnaya, or widow, we should say, is trying to build opposition against Putin from where she is abroad, but it's going to be extremely difficult because, again, you have so little credibility when you're abroad. Even though you're abroad for perfectly legitimate reasons, namely you need to try to stay alive.
And it takes it takes an extraordinary amount of courage too. Elizabeth, thank you so much. Elizabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and the author of Goodbye Globalisation. It is now 5:45. You're with Early Breakfast here on Times Radio, and it's me, Rosie Wright, keeping you company. Now, a little bit later on this morning, and I mean in 15 minutes' time, we're going to find out the top spot on the Sunday Times Best Place to Live. That's next.